I think you have to think about it from the perspective of a bit of a broken record here around ultimately what problem you're trying to solve. So to my mind, they inextricably intertwine because you have a customer and a customer finds you through multiple routes.
I want to answer it more from the perspective of marketing. Who builds the brand? Is it the e-commerce? No. Is it the stores? Who gets the attribution of all of the costs of building the brand? Because to me, building the brand is agnostic of the channel, right? It's building the ecosystem. It's building the demand. And again, we see all the direct-to-consumer players are now going in the opposite direction of opening stores because they recognize the cost of driving traffic to the online store is getting higher and higher just doing it digitally. So you need the stores in order to get a better cost per acquisition.
So I remember my team put together a report. So when eComm first started kind of really becoming part of this conversation, I remember we started pivoting the way we viewed the P&L and started lumping rent and marketing together, whether you had stores or whether you didn't. So it just became this notion of the same way now we have to segment marketing into transactional versus brand building. It's just this holistic view of what's my CAC. CAC is like the easiest and yet the worst term ever invented because like we just flock to it and like CAC means we don't have to think about cost of retention. It means we don't have to think about brand building in the future.
I'd actually like to bring a question to Simeon because I think this has a lot to do with the nature of your work, Simeon. Because I think this is a story of valuation, right? How are you guys screwing this up with your valuations?
So a few things there. First of all, it's our job to screw things up. So I appreciate you recognizing that. Thanks for the shout out. Second of all, Steve, Seth, Carl, I would like to henceforth not simply be given the number questions, okay?
Welcome and thank you for joining me today. My name is Gary Newbury. I'm a senior executive on call helping businesses in a make, move, sell flow of consumer goods and services. My purpose is to inspire business leaders, particularly those within the consumer products and retailing space, to think big, be bold, scale, adapt and win, one epic supply chain transformation at a time. There's additional content available through my website, RetailAID.ca, or on my YouTube channel, RetailAID. Be sure to check it out. As the business world faces much volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity, organizations need to be tapping into resources with an inside edge on transitioning their teams to be agile, innovative, and digital, with thought leaders, experts, and senior executives who have mastery of operational turnarounds and strategic transformations to help reorientate their enterprises. There's great material to get through here, so let's get started. Thanks for joining us, everybody. I'm Gary Newbury. I'm an interim Chief Supply Chain Officer focused on retail supply chains. I brought my crew again, and we've added Roslyn Griner from Montreal to talk about some interesting things. So before we kick off, I'd like everybody to introduce themselves. Just a quick one-liner, and we'll launch into the question.
Hi, I'm Roslyn Griner. I'm a marketing exec that's worked in beauty and fashion, and I'm a brand strategist.
So today it's actually a double channel because I was just going to channel Mr. Remarkable, but he basically challenged back and said that there are two Mr. Remarkables, which ironically are Mr. Steve Dennis and Mr. Seth Godin. So I'm going to have to go back to my Juilliard training and really try to figure out how I can channel two people at the same time, but I'll try my best.
Okay, I'm Jeff Roberts. It's very nice to meet you. I'm a management consultant based out of London. I currently work for a strategy and innovation company called Jump, and I lead their futures practice.
Awesome. Hey, everyone. Simeon Siegel. I am a managing director at BMO Capital Markets. So that's my Canadian tie here. And I love being a part of these conversations. Look forward to where this one goes and to what I'm sure will be many more.
Excellent. Now, just before the holidays, there was a little bit of a sparky conversation and promoted by a guy called Brittain Ladd. And he equated where we are in retailing to being given a Tesla car, and he equated that to the e-commerce channel, and being asked to tow the truck with 1,000 pounds of scrap metal on it called the stores. And he was arguing on the light of people like Macy's and HBC, Saks, etc., all thinking that, you know, there's some great financial value, some great customer value in splitting off the e-commerce. It's almost going back to the future. You know, we've struggled to get everything together. He was arguing that they should allow the e-commerce to continue its growth pattern, its speed, its convenience, whatever, and leave the stores to do its own thing. And the interesting thing that I found in not necessarily just that discussion, but the wider conversation around Macy's was their business is worth something like 8 billion or something like that market value before they announced that they wanted to split off the e-commerce side, and that was worth 14 billion. So, you know, the message to management would have been close the stores immediately, stop wasting time on stores. But I think we're missing the point there if we think that that's the way forward for retail. So I'm just going to, hopefully I've encapsulated that question in some kind of framing for us to have a pretty explosive conversation on this subject. So over to you guys.
Nobody wants to jump on this grenade, do they? Okay, I will. So I think, from my mind, I think you have to think about it from the perspective of a bit of a broken record here around ultimately what problem you're trying to solve. So to my mind, they inextricably intertwine because you have a customer and a customer finds you through multiple routes. Sometimes that route is in a physical location. Sometimes it's in a digital space. Sometimes they overlap, intertwine. And we know that real people move across both oftentimes simultaneously. You know, you work, might be in the store and then you'll go on your phone to see if you can find it online, etc. So to my mind, there tends to be a benefit from keeping the two together. And I think there's significant value. And I think in most instances where it's been proposed to separate them, it strikes me as foolish to do so. So it's the sort of financial engineering of the 80s is what it feels like to me, is, you know, buying a company and tearing it apart because you can get more on the open market for the parts. But I think you have to take into consideration, and I'll stop after this, the second point I think is that you've taken into consideration sort of individual brands don't operate in splendid isolation. So what happens in the wider ecology in which you're operating? And so what's going on with other places? And so the parallel I would draw for this, and I know it's not a digital versus physical store model, but the idea of what Saks is happening to Saks with Saks Fifth Avenue and off Saks, and should they split the two? Because what you can see there is that it actually makes a lot of sense, because for luxury, it oftentimes makes more sense if you have overstocks, et cetera, to route them through subsidiary or secondary channels for places like, you know, Ross, TKX, or TJX rather, whoever who can scoop that up without diminishing the core brand. And so I think it's a case of trying to figure out what problem you're trying to solve ultimately, and in what environment are you operating against that. So I tend to move more towards keep them together, because that's where you find customers. But if you find yourself in an environment where there's significant drag in one channel, like the Saks and off Saks channel, it would strike me that it's worthy of consideration under circumstances like that.
I'd actually like to bring a question to Simeon, because I think this has a lot to do with the nature of your work, Simeon, because I think this is a story of valuation, right? I mean, it's sort of the tug of war between strategic optimization, which is longer term, what I think Jeff was just referring to about how you build and strengthen a company over a longer period of time, versus shorter term value optimization in the market's eyes and the multiples that you can get versus, and e-commerce clearly gets way better multiples than physical commerce, the way that the market evaluates the future revenues, you know, the present value of future annuities. So what's your take on the role that, put it another way, how are you guys screwing this up with your valuations?
So a few things there. First of all, it's our job to screw things up, so I appreciate you recognizing that. Thanks for the shout out. Second of all, Steve, Seth, Carl, I would like to henceforth not simply be given the number questions. Okay, there's more to me than just numbers, please. Gosh, I actually wanted to make a comment on something Jeff said, but I'll come back to it because I think he hit something really poignant. So let's do the less fun part of this first, and then come back to Jeff's ecosystem conversation. So last year, there were companies that traded. What I love is siphoning valuation from market cap, because at the end of the day, the only thing that matters is how big is a company, but a lot of times we forget that, right? Well, one of our favorite topics, which I'm sure we're not going to be able to dance around considering the day, but right now everyone's talking about Peloton's stock price being below its IPO price, ignoring the fact that they've actually issued a ton of stock since then. Let's think of the total company size. So this nuance is really important. And so what I would look at was, you had some of these e-commerce businesses that were larger, much smaller revenue bases, larger market caps than Urban Outfitters and Nordstrom and brands they would love to become when they grew up. But because Urban and Nordstrom have stores, profitable stores, no less, but because they have stores, their total market cap was lower than these much smaller businesses. That's, I don't know, problematic, confusing, bizarre, pick the descriptor. So, but whether it is or is not, right, there's two jobs to have. There's normative, prescriptive. There's deciding, do we decide whether something makes sense or do we recognize what exists? And so the financial engineering is simply a recognition of this currently makes sense. There is a value here. This is being traded accordingly. So why wouldn't I entertain that? Do I think that makes sense? Do I think that's good or bad? I don't think in a vacuum we should answer that question. I think the conversation, a little bit to Jeff's point, is if it doesn't impact the operations negative and it elevates the valuation, then why not? If it impacts the operations positive and it elevates, no brainer. If it impacts the operations negatively, then all of a sudden we have to say, just because something's worth this today doesn't mean it'll be worth this tomorrow. And we've seen, and we're in the middle of seeing, a huge retrenchment in all of these eComm, high valuation, high margin, or high multiple stories. So that's kind of how I would take that. I will take a breather knowing that in my mind, I definitely want to come back to Jeff's really fun ecosystem point.
I want to answer it more from the perspective of marketing. Who builds the brand? Is it the e-commerce? No. Is it the stores? Who gets the attribution of all of the costs of building the brand? Because to me, building the brand is sort of agnostic of the channel, right? It's building the ecosystem. It's building the demand. And again, we see all the direct-to-consumer players are now going in the opposite direction of opening stores because they recognize the cost of driving traffic to the online store is getting higher and higher just doing it digitally. So you need the stores in order to get a better cost per acquisition. I've lived under both situations at Reitman's because we were decentralized where we had the e-commerce kind of going off on their own. It wasn't done with the nuance of Saks where, you know, they gave the right attribution, like if the return came to the store, the e-comm, if it was purchased online, got the credit for the return. We were kind of mishmashed together, but I'm also going to say a lot of the online players are not so profitable. Where does all the costs go? Not all the costs get attributed correctly to the online store versus the offline. Stores were actually profitable at Reitman's. So I just kind of query about the whole profitability. You can make P&Ls kind of dance wherever you'd like to dance. That's all I'm going to say.
Just always comes back to the numbers.
Can I just pick up a point that Roslyn mentioned, which was the native digital brands going into store retail? Is there a pattern in how they're looking at the store format, which might inform something about the current store formats of people going the other way? In stores have gone to e-commerce and trying to create their omni-channel experience. Is there some important point in how they're thinking about stores and their formatting, their organization and their presentation of a brand that could be learnt by legacy retailers that is not being learnt by legacy retailers?
Something I've been paying a lot of attention to ever since Casper started trying to do their first dream centers and that sort of experiential. So I think what you're getting at, Gary, is first of all, obviously they're pretty small footprints because they tend to be very, specific to a category. They're not these large, they don't require these large square footages to make an impression. They really sort of captivate it and seem to almost have more of a pop-up take on retail where they try to keep it continually fresh, changing. And I don't think any of them really do long-term leases in any substantial manner, except for like Warby, which is, it has definitely a more permanent view of physical retail. What I found really interesting, because Simeon's right, it all comes back to the numbers, is each time any one of these companies have come in their S1 to IPO, within the first 2 paragraphs, you have them talking about how many stores they plan on opening, which I think is indicative of what they're trying to do. And even our famous Peloton, Simeon, has some physical spaces. In Brookfield, I remember seeing one of their first little areas there where you could go try the Pelotons, and they had this cool sort of Sonos-like environment that they'd replicated. So just to say, Gary, yes, there's a different approach. And obviously it's a lot what Roslyn was just saying. It's more about communicating the brand than selling the product. It's more about, how should I be thinking about this brand more than how should I be buying this brand? And then because the buying part, they've already figured out. They've got that whole channel, locked down. What they need to do is create awareness. And the way to do that is having these really sort of cool, engaging stores that only think secondly of sales and first to think about getting you to have a positive outlook on what the brand's trying to put out in the market.
They're more seen as like part of the brand extension, but also as media in order to get that acquisition of that customer, which is so different from how legacy retailers view their real estate property. Here's the demographic I'm going after. Here's the cost per square foot. It was always about cost per square foot. Can I repay the P&L in a year or two? And that's how it was evaluated. Marketing didn't even come into this situation or even the discussion. I was never invited to sit at the table, when we were discussing real estate and store. It was always the operational side of the business. And that's the difference between the digitally native brands, where it's all about marketing. It's all about creating that sort of Instagrammable environment to kind of get that social media going. And that's the difference between, a Macy's is not exactly the most Instagrammable location,
They acquired one of the most Instagrammable, right?
And it didn't last very long. They didn't know how to nurture it.
Shots fired. So I remember so my team put together a report. When eComm first started kind of really becoming part of this conversation, I remember we started pivoting the way we viewed the P&L and started lumping rent and marketing together, whether you had stores or whether you didn't. So it just became this notion of the same way now we have to segment marketing into transactional versus brand building. It's just this holistic view of what's my CAC. CAC is like the easiest and yet the worst term ever invented, because like we just flock to it, and like CAC means we don't have to think about cost of retention. It means we don't have to think about brand building in the future. Like you just take whatever sales and marketing dollars you spent now, divide them by whatever units you sold, and boom, easy. That's not how it works, right? Like we have to think about what are you trying to build? And this goes back to this idea of like the segmenting. Do we split off the businesses? Does it look really good today because the valuation is good today, but it's not going to look good tomorrow? Like ultimately, we're all in the business of storytelling, and storytelling is for the future, right? It's lived happily ever after in the future. Once upon a time is how we start. So I think like that's where we need to internalize. Like Roslyn, I think what you're saying makes so much sense. It's this idea of transactional dollars are important, be they stores, be they marketing dollars, be they whatever. But brand building is what sets you up for the future.
Maybe I'll just build on that, because I think it brings an interesting thing around metrics and CAC. And I don't know if you're familiar with Pete Fader and Dan McCarthy's work around customer lifetime value and how that combines into customer acquisition cost. Yeah, and I don't know if he did a paper with a colleague of mine and another professor out of Stern, where they talked about all these crazy measurements, and especially in S1s, where you get community-based EBITDA, where you back out all the marketing costs to sort of justify your metrics. The more recent manifestations. It's a great paper, by the way, if you haven't seen it. It really between Maxim Cohen, Daniel, and Aswath Moran did this really spectacular piece in calling shenanigans and these metrics. But McCarthy's work, especially around corporate-based customer valuation model, where they basically really try to get to the core of the contribution of the acquisition cost versus the lifetime value, is I think where this whole conversation is headed. And even when I'm doing corporate coaching, that's a lot of the thing I love to talk about this. I'm doing a class on it again, and how it even changes the cultures of companies when you start shifting and looking at this sort of way of viewing the world versus, as Roslyn was saying, this really, I think, detrimental square footage. Anything that as soon as I hear the word square feet, I run for the hills.
Run for the hills. But I question about the Generation Z, because I used to look a lot, at the CRM data for, the lifetime value. And there was a predictability about as you got older, you bought so much. I think Gen Z doesn't have the same level of customer loyalty that, say, the preceding generationals. And so they're much more likely, they're into thrifting, they're into buying from one store 1 minute and another. There is not as much customer loyalty. So it's interesting to me to see all of the loyalty plans, like we see Nike kind of getting into it. Maybe the sneakerheads have more loyalty depending on the category, but it's so much more difficult to get that repeat customer to stay with one single brand, versus like wherever you bring me value, I switch, as opposed to this, like, I love this retailer, I'm going to stay with them and buy from them forever and ever. I don't believe in that kind of forever and ever anymore with one single retailer.
I think that's really interesting, because I think even if you're against, say, forces that are driving purchasing power or purchasing activity in that different way, because I was going to mention Dan McCarthy as well. So I think it's a great point, Carl, because I think that I love those slides. I refer to them constantly when he puts teaching slides on. But the whole idea of using customer lifetime value as the metric, I think what it does is it changes two principal things, right? It forces you to think about it instead of looking at it through a pure sort of old school finance view, which is if we decompose this P&L, what are bits I can control and what are bits that I can't control? And what do I think I can put my hands on? And then it forces you to actually think about, it drives a behavioral change. I think it brings us back to the point we started on, which is by taking a channel-centric view of a business, I think what you do is it's easy to deal with from a decomposed P&L perspective, because it gives you something that you feel like you've got control over and you can manage that. But by taking something like customer lifetime value, it forces you to take in all the things that might be influencing, right? So what's the push and pull in the environment of what brings them back? How do I allocate resources in a way that enable us to understand what actually drives that? How can I actually think about the way that marketing and all of its fabulous permutations might look, from the very basic stuff on just building awareness all the way to experiments we might run on pricing variations across the piece. And it allows you a framework, I think, to pull those things together. And I think it eradicates this question at the start, right? It sort of, it forces you to think about the whole thing rather than saying, is that channel worth more than this channel? And therefore we should pull the two apart.
I'm just saying, the customer journey isn't linear. So, people go back and forth between, they go into social, they go back into the store, they see something, they don't have my size, I go online. That's where it's so difficult, because you're not being able to pigeon saying a very linear, I'm only shopping online, I'm only shopping in store. No customers like that.
Exactly.
So okay, so you hit my point. So what I love, listen, I think CAC and LTV are really important, and since our general ethos is everything has to somehow touch on Peloton, McCarthy has done such phenomenal work there as well. So let's just check the box, and okay, great, 6 degrees of flywheels. So, but I think the LTV, I worry that, and it's obviously incredibly important and the right way to think about the business, but I worry that the LTV is sort of at odds with how we approach retail, right? The beauty of retail is that we're all optimistically delusional. If not, we wouldn't be able to do this job. And so what that means is we assume that we're going to comp, like the comp, right? If we're forgetting about same store sales, if we're forgetting about sales square foot, we still want to think about comp. Comp by definition means doing better than we did last year. So whether LTV as an entity of thinking, okay, my average lifetime value sort of seems to be completely at odds with this optimistic delusion that we can always do better. And so I sit there and I think we just went through a pandemic where we've all spoken about how my view is the pandemic drastically changed and saved retail, and there's a constant evolution, right? Everyone says retail is an evolution. Well, if retail is constantly evolving, how do we have a really good concrete view of what someone's lifetime value is, right? To Roslyn's point, it's not linear. You're going up and down, you're going in and out, you're trading brands. So we can come up with a number that's helpful to frame our projections around. But at the end of the day, Jeff, your point of let's think about it that way. I think that's a much healthier approach of think holistically, but to actually say, I've got a cost and I've got a duration that I expect people to spend. It just, how frequently, if we were to take a vote, what percentage do we think anyone actually ever hits their LTV, right? It's an average, but is it real? If you're a retailer, you kind of hope not. You hope you keep feeding it. So.
But you keep feeding it more SKUs, because one of the things when you're running an online business, and especially now, everyone's become a marketplace, right? Because the more you have the opportunity to build your basket, right? I'm just going to put more categories, more products. Nobody has the capability of browsing these ginormous marketplaces. Think about it. When you're doing search, do you ever go beyond the first page of Google? No. So I'm just saying right now, it's this thought that if I bring more, I'm going to be able to get her to buy more, right? That is I'm going to get her to buy, if she's buying clothing, she's going to buy shoes, and then she's going to buy makeup. And that's almost like every single store becomes like a mini department store, because they keep thinking, I'm going to increase the lifetime value. I'm going to keep her shopping because she's going to buy every category for me. Can you be a category expert in everything? No. But that's basically how everybody kind of has the delusion. The more I bring in, the more I'm going to get her to buy from me.
We tried that with stores. I wrote an article right in the start of the pandemic called Going Big, and that was that the typical strategy for a store-based retail approach is to build bigger stores, build more of them, put more stuff in them. All we've done with, say, marketplace or e-commerce, which is in some ways has migrated to a marketplace, is just do a version of that virtually and do it a lot faster. And I think that these are overwhelming things for retailers. We've had tech, we've had marketplace, we've had growth of different categories that we can sell. But I think we've missed the essence of retailing. It's actually finding that customer and really matching our proposition to their needs and doing a really good job of that. And I think to do that, and it's a point you raised, Roslyn, and I did have a big grin around it, where marketing doesn't feature in that discussion. It's marketing is marketing comms, not marketing, where it is that matching. And I think that the retail model generally doesn't feature marketing in that organizational structure, in that C-suite. And if it is a CMO, if we're lucky to elevate the position of marketing to that level, we're still doing the weekly flyer and working out what the digital spending ought to be, rather than actually positioning the business and the proposition, the go-to-market, and how it all comes together, how it appears to some of the points that Jeff makes, how it appears to the customer.
Yeah, what problem are we solving? That's where it all starts from, Jeff. I mean, simplistically, that's what marketing is about. What problem am I solving? And how am I going to do it differently from anybody else, right?
What you're saying, Gary, is you're not buying your multivitamins from Best Buy?
No,
But they're there.
not yet.
I mean,
Too
Indigo
bad.
doesn't sell books anymore, do they?
I think we're one of the things we're not touching on, and it sort of extends from LTV and how we're trying to calculate and pull the future forward. And in closed doors, where this conversation is leading right now is marketers are freaked the fuck out about not knowing about attribution. They're seeing the collapse now of the digital breadcrumbs that are being, for the right reasons around privacy being closed. They're like, at least I was just starting to understand kind of where the attribution, what the influences of purchase, what my ROI was, and a lot of stuff. And this is the rug's being pulled from underneath me right now. And I'm like, they're all pretending to be cool and they think they've got this figured out. But I was in a meeting not too long ago with about a dozen CMOs, and we had the head of Google with us, and there was supposed to be a whole hour around talking about sort of marketing trends, and we just spoke about that for the whole hour, because they were like, well, how am I going to figure? No, yeah, but I understand. How am I going to know where this person came from and what led them to me? And so, and even Google's like, listen, we have a couple of projects on the go, but we haven't figured this out, and that's going to tie directly into how we value the long-term value of attribution.
Why do you think
Carl,
all
I've got a question on
retailers
that.
want loyalty programs? They want to own the customer through the email,
first party
right?
data,
They want first party data.
I want to come back to that in a second.
So, Carl,
Simeon.
So how big, the CMOs, generally speaking, how big were their companies' revenues, like ranges?
It was, I would say, probably centered around mid. So, a couple $100 million probably. There was some smaller ones, but there was no $1 billion brands in the room though.
So here's why, that's not an accident, right? Ironically, the largest brands in the world, and this touches on our last conversation, the largest brands in the world are not the ones that we hear complaining about iOS, right? The largest brands in the world who have never had the customer data, right? Who have never been right there, who have never known exactly what the frequency of shop. They had to make their own estimates. They have to do some work. Those are the brands that are the billions, and those are the brands that actually are not complaining about losing Apple. It's the smaller brands, it's the digitally natives that they were born knowing everything. And yet, going back to our last conversation, their revenue bases, great businesses, some not, but their revenue bases are a fraction of what these large businesses are. So it gets you kind of thinking, is knowing first party data a crutch, right? Is it really this amazing unlock, or is it a crutch? Because why is it that all the companies that know first party data are drastically smaller businesses, and the ones that are just doing it the good old way, the ones that, to Roslyn's point, every new company is trying to be a department store. That's weird because we all think department stores are dead, right? Obviously they're not. So it's like this fascinating idea of when we do bring it back down to the numbers, the big companies don't appear to need the specific granular data. The smaller ones are the ones that are really freaking out about it.
They also have some of the best, look back to Roslyn's point, they have some of the best loyalty programs running. I mean, Starbucks, Nike. I think the biggest news story in retail marketing of last year, or the most fascinating one, it was the Nike and Dick's combination where we're starting to see a retailer saying, yeah, we're giving you we're sharing the data. I mean, I think people didn't understand the implications of what that means. I mean, that is wild to see. That shows that even these big guys, I mean, are like, we need deeper visibility and we're not going to get it through these other methods. So we need to, I don't know how they convinced them to do it, quite honestly. I don't even know Dick's really know what they got into, but that's another topic for another time.
Well, and what Dick's data looks like, right? To your point, like Dick's is not one of those CMOs that were in the conversation, I would assume. So like even that framework, like the big story, it's just a different level. It's this belief, like, because I hear it also, right? We hear it all the time about this complaint of where marketing is going and how am I gonna survive, right? CAC's gonna go up and I'm gonna pay more to get less data. But you look at these very large, very successful businesses that have managed to do it just fine. And they figure it out. And whether it's a loyalty program or whether it's a partnership, like I just think it's important to acknowledge who's complaining and how big they are.
Interesting.
Also, look at the fact that we're moving away from it was like you had to master digital performance marketing, right? And now everybody's investing in old school communication. How many of these new brands are on television? I've never seen so many brands on television. Everyone says television is dead. It's only, the streaming services are the only thing that works, but I still see a lot of advertising on television. People are doing direct mail. It's a novelty now to get something as mail in the mail. So it's like, you remember, catalogs are dead, direct mail is dead, TV is dead. And now slowly but surely marketers are going back to some of the tools, the old tools in the toolbox, because they're working. So it goes back to, the big guys were always like advertising on television, mass audience. I don't think it's a simplistic question. It is really difficult to do marketing because now you have so many tools at your disposal and none of them are like a one-stop shop, fixes every solution for every brand. So it really has to be tailored.
We're far from living in a world of absolutes. So as soon as you hear the future of, and there's not an S after the word future, or death of, and basically disregard both of those extremities and just try to find what's happening in between those two, right?
I think it's, and I say this as someone who's paid to chase shiny things for a living, is that I think there is a whole thing around chasing the shiny thing. And the reason people are on TV is because that's where the vast majority of buyers are. People watch TV. Most people aren't on streaming services. Like if the demographics of it show the agencies tend to be, who are the people, who come in and sell these ideas, are staffed by disproportionately younger people who then are themselves chasing the shiny thing. And let's face it, it's fun to do new stuff. That's why, I got into this work, is because it is inherently more interesting to me to do new stuff. But I think we oftentimes do it at scale and do it in such a way that it makes us feel like we're moving forward when the foundations themselves haven't shifted that fast. So we have a priority as external advisors to constantly dig up new stuff, right? I'm pulling the curtain back, but this is just the reality of it. Yeah. It's constantly our job to show this is new, this is interesting, because clients buy novelty. If you say to somebody, you know what, the LLB catalog is amazing, you should go back and use the LLB catalog. Let's think about it a little bit. Think about, amazing what that catalog was. It was so exciting, the thought it makes when it lands on the door. These ideas that you would go back and do something like that, we have come at least far enough that it's delightfully interesting to do something because it has a vaguely old school feel to it. But I think the fact of the matter is things don't move as quickly as we oftentimes would like to believe that they are. There's a very small strata of us, and I include myself in that, who are so involved in this that we chase the very new thing because it's exciting. It is exciting. But I think the reality of it is, and this is the thing that I think it comes back to this, which is we chase these new things because oftentimes they're easy to generate data on, or we can get access to it, and it makes us feel as though we're in control of it, where it solves somebody else's problem. If you're a CMO, principally what you want is to be left alone by the CFO. You want CFO to just get off your case. That's your primary objective. And the easiest way to do that is to feed data to them that provides some level of attribution so that you can say, right, we did this, we did that. But I think the reality is oftentimes like you want to step back and say, look at the whole big picture. What are you trying to do? You're ultimately trying to sell something. You're trying to connect with somebody who will buy it, and then you've got it there to sell it. And the way that you want to actually generate that is that it moves us past, I constantly ask this, is channel attribution worth doing? It feels like a lot of effort to get you done. I know you need some understanding, but as much effort as we put in to get finer and finer grades of detail on it, what do you get from that in return is a question that I think is a place that we don't start often enough.
It's just so hard because when you're constantly being asked as a marketer, what's your return? Like if I give you $100, you're going to get me $100 back. So it makes you not want to take risks, right? It makes you want to do things where you have proven things like, yes, if I discount, I will sell more goods. So, but it's a dangerous path that you go down when you don't want to explore. I think there has to be a balance between like doing the things that move the business on a day-to-day, but then doing the things that are more futuristic that might not have a complete return on investment today will have a future return. it goes back to that lifetime value of like, we still need to do things that will keep her engaged, will, keep her intrigued. I mean, I was listening yesterday, to the head of Instagram talking about that they're going to turn Instagram into subscriptions for influencers and creators. So you'll have to pay to get access to the content. I'm like, okay, like subscription business is dead in retail. And yet now we're going to start that with like social media. So it's just like the kind of circular thinking that's kind of going around, which is interesting because I look at Stitch Fix and like they've gone full circle. Is it relevant anymore? The whole subscription box, it depends on the category, right?
I don't remember if we talked about this last time, but so your point about the sellout, you will sell more if you discount. I'm going to be optimistically delusional that that was the takeaway from COVID, right? I'm going to hope that this was the ability, the primary silver lining was that people like me and Jeff apparently doesn't like CFOs, number of people are the worst, but like, so we all say, you can never cut, right? You can't shrink revenues. That's not a thing. That's not allowed. Grow to infinity. And so what happened during COVID was it did it for you, right? Everyone's revenues collapsed. And so if you're a large company and your revenues collapse and your expenses collapse, well, you became a startup. And what do startups do really well? They're nimble, right? They pivot. So you had a few of these companies that really took advantage and said, I can do more with less. And so that's this idea. And like we did this, my team put a lot of work into this. We created a price elasticity of demand model at the beginning of the pandemic, where we basically showed some of the very large brands that we all know really well that were, quote, dead, selling $5 billion worth of products, but they were dead. We found that if they committed to raising price 25% and held to it and didn't give up, right? Didn't throw in the towel after the first month of seeing revs, 25% AUR increase, they could walk away with 40% of their units lost and still make more dollars. Forget about margin, still make more dollars. Give up 40%, 40 of your units, and you walk out ahead. It was mind-blowing, but we saw it. And that's why Victoria's Secret and L Brands was one of the best stocks of the S&P, if not the best, right? That's why Under Armour was able to recreate itself. So that idea of like recognizing that just giving promotions is not the approach, I think hopefully that's one of the main takeaways we're all going to go and we're going to hold on to. And as soon as now stimulus and pent-up demand, like we're lapping it all, we're going to see who crosses that line and who holds it.
These container ships finally, those September container ships show up in February and March, packed full of stuff, and we're going to have shelves overflowing with goods that you're going to see some old reflexes, unfortunately, quickly return.
I think that's hard, but I mean, very much to Simeon's point, that's the tobacco model, right? Volume continues to drop. There's enormous amounts of pricing baked into that continues to push through. I mean, I know it's a category nobody likes to talk about, but the reality is that those companies, the big four, are ridiculously profitable. I mean, it's a low margin product to create and get out, but because they have inordinate amounts of pricing power, they've recognized that you can do it and you can hold it. And I think that was one of the things that, and I was hopeful on this, but I think you're right, Carl. I think when we see markets flooded with goods that are 6 months late to shelf, we'll see discounting come back. But that was one of the things that I think was so potentially powerful by what we were saying, was that the retailers, I think, sometimes forget how much pricing power they hold on to, how much they can. And there seems to be a lack of willingness to say, right, we're just going to hold it. It was back to what I started with by saying is that, we used to have these secondary channels, like, you think TJX, great example, right? They take all this stuff, they throw it on a trailer and it shows up in store. Nobody knows what's on it. Manager doesn't know what's going to come through, but it gives larger brands an opportunity to offload excess capacity without necessarily hurting margin. And so I think, there's a world, and I think if we look outside, and I beat this drum too often, but if you look outside of your own business and think about the wider world in which you're operating, oftentimes those choices change how they look when it's not just you thinking that you're in fierce competition with everybody. There's other places. Sometimes you're collaborating, sometimes you're competing, but there's other places where it spills into.
There's also a new channel, Jeff. There's a new channel of the resale market, right? Like the ThredUps, the Poshmarks, the thrift. This is a place where all that inventory that's coming in late, it can either show up at TJX, but it could also show up in these resale markets, which is growing like triple digit right now. I mean, these are big businesses, and even traditional retailers like H&M are now basically taking control of their own resale market. So I think that gives you that, like, is that going to impact the TJXs of the world when you have your own market to kind of unload all of this stuff. So it's going to be very interesting times, but a lot of people reduced their inventory during COVID. So I don't know that people are, going to be showing up with a lot of inventory kind of coming up, especially apparel, where they recognize the shelf life, and the seasonality of the product doesn't work anymore.
I agree with that. Seasonality is going to play a big part in this. If snowsuits show up in May, it's not going to be a factor of. So, but it will impact purchasing for the following cycle. So we'll see how that all plays out.
Or alternatively, retailers can take this time before that happens. They must know what might be coming over the line as such in the next few months, and actually take a chance to really rethink their whole business. And the original discussion started from a point of because e-commerce is accelerating, growing, etc. Should that be spun off and whatever? We worked through a whole range of different things there. But my thought on this is actually perhaps slightly different, and that is that legacy brands add in e-commerce and then going, oh, this didn't quite work out, should we just flog it off and carry on as we were? I just wonder if where we've been through for the last 2 years and whether or not we've learned enough as individual retailers to actually remodel our stores completely, to actually throw the whole concept up in the air and go, okay, how can we do this in a way that's fit for 2020s, not 1980? When we think about, when I pop into my Best Buy, not to single those out, but they're slightly more advanced than some of the other retailers I go into. They have the sort of returns desk and pick up in store desk and stuff like that. But the store is still the same. We've still got broadly the same categories on the website and get loads of other things, as Carl suggests. But back to the fundamental problem, what problem are we trying to solve? And beyond that, what solution do we need to find to do this? Is e-commerce part of this? Yes or no? It almost certainly is, depending on what your purpose is. And for me, I think the movement to smaller stores, smaller store formats, which Carl kind of alluded to earlier on, I think that's the movement forward. The digital natives are coming to town. They know all this customer information because they know individual customers, and their approach to this is small stores, small, highly branded, experiential stores. When I go into my local, say Walmart, Canadian Tire, whatever it might be, it's 1980s again. I don't get beyond 1980s. What are you doing for me as a customer to solve my 2020s problems, my 2020 feelings about things? And I'm just seeing rows and rows of categories in aisles, and I know what my shopping trip is looking like, but I want it to be different.
Maybe I'll just wrap up, because coming back to Brittain's original premise, and I think the piece that is missing when a lot of these analysis is the dichotomy of what I call the Lampert-Baker model, which is a very lucrative model. If you don't have enough hope, and I'm hopefully not going to make it the Lampert-Baker-Gannett model, but if you have so little hope in the future, that by far your most lucrative path forward is pull everything apart and sell those off. And to your point earlier, your $8 billion Macy's is worth probably 20 if you sell it off in pieces. But what they miss, why the Nordstroms and even here in Canada, the Simons, and their vision is they understand that, yes, they could make more money pulling the e-commerce piece out. But what they're really doing by pulling that piece out is they lose the e-commerce revenue part, which is not it's all the e-influence part. E-commerce is not about transaction. It's what it unlocks about everything where this whole industry is going towards is that blurring, is this idea that if I don't have, and that's the even with small retailers still today, the tough conversations. If you're doing this to sell more online, you're missing the much bigger picture, which is all the other things you're going to be able to do once you have that online capability. You're going to be able to be a lot more relevant going forward in terms of all the other things that you're going to be able to do digitally, which is digital, physical. I mean, it's like you're not going to be. It's harder and harder to tell the two apart. If you pull that out from the organization, that capability out, and you really put up a wall between the two, then basically, you're announcing to the world that you're not going to be around 5 years from now.
Amen to that. I think Carl nailed it.
I'm also going to say, we don't think about the website is your storytelling platform. It's where I tell my stories. It's my content generation. And as a marketer, I really need that. to be able to tell my stories. And if it's in the control of e-commerce who wants to say, I just want to put what is, going to increase my conversion, on the center of the page versus telling the story in a fluid way through every single part of the website, that's the difference between marketing and a channel, right? And I think we have to think of this as it is marketing, it is a channel, it is the brand, it is the expression of the brand, it's the first touch point of the brand, just as a store is. And if they're not intertwined, I don't know what we're doing, because I don't see that as being the future.
I've been trying desperately to come up with like my own celebrity analogy here, and I'm like really struggling to figure out who's separated. Like I'm thinking like Jordan when he went to baseball, like you take apart, like if you're left without the good to go for the bad, then what do you become? You become a team owner. I don't know. So I've got my task set out for me for the next one. But no, I mean, this is, I think we've covered a lot of it. And I think Carl just kind of really, it's hard to follow that comment, especially when we think about not being around in 5 years. I'm going to remain optimistic, delusional or not.
Thanks everybody for tuning in. It's been another exciting and far-reaching conversation about the art and science of retailing and what we're trying to solve, how we solve it, and what we can look forward to in the future. Thanks everybody. Thank you for listening today. I hope the information has been valuable for you and your team. You can connect with me via the website retail.ca and go to the contact page, or via LinkedIn by typing linkedin.com/in/last-mile. Look forward to hearing from you and playing an active part with your supply chain and your business's transformation as you start to act boldly, think big, scale, adapt, and win.